Welcome to our lecture on the Islamic world through the year 1450. We are still in period 1. We've finished with East Asia and are moving forward in period 1. So the first unit that we're going to talk about is the origins of Islam. So when we talk about the rise of Islam, Islam is the fastest growing religion today, and it is monotheistic. So what does monotheistic mean? Well, mono means one. Theistic refers to theology or a religion. And so this is a religion with one God, and that God goes by the name Allah. Now it's interesting to note that the Islamic God, Allah, is the same God that is worshipped in Judaism and in Christianity. In Judaism, they refer to the one true God as Yahweh. In Christianity, they refer to God the Father, and then they also have the concept of the Holy Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit in some different denominations. And in Islam, they have the concept of God as Allah, but they're all referencing the same deity. In fact, they all share the same origin story through the prophet known as Abraham. So we'll talk about that as we get further in the lecture. They are the predominant religion in Arab countries, such as the Middle East and North Africa, including Iran, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iraq. So you have a very wide spread of Islam throughout the world today, and that all originated in the Middle East in 622 CE, when, according to the Islamic faith, Allah sent a messenger in the form of the angel Gabriel to speak to his prophet Muhammad. And Muhammad memorized this recitation of God's words until it could be written down into the holy book, the Quran. And then by the time of his death in 632 CE, we've seen that Islam has emerged as not only a major religion, but also a major political and military power as his followers conquer Mecca. So we're going to talk further about the origins of Islam. It's important to remember these dates: 622 CE, referring to the recitation of the Quran from the angel Gabriel to the prophet, and then 632, which is the date in which Muhammad returned to the city of Mecca and conquered it for Allah, getting rid of the polytheistic religions that were dominant within that major economic hub. So during the Classical Age, which is the year 600 BCE all the way to the year 600 CE, all of the world's religions had emerged or evolved except for Islam by that time. So you have Buddhism emerging in Asia, Taoism around the year 100 BCE, along with Confucianism in China, Hinduism, one of the most ancient religions that emerged. It emerged around 2000 BCE. And then Judaism also in 2000 BCE, as represented by this Star of David. And then Christianity came out of Judaism in roughly the year 0 to 33 CE. And then we also see the development of Islam coming from its roots in Judaism. In the 1600s, you're going to see that the Middle East was very fragmented politically. And so that fragmentation between different states within the Arabian Peninsula is going to allow for Islam to emerge and to really take hold. And once Islam emerges, it is going to help unite the Arabian Peninsula under one centralized rule. Now remember, since this is a video, you can pause at any point if I'm going too fast, or you can slow down the video. Please make sure you're taking detailed notes, and don't think that taking notes just means writing down what's on the PowerPoint. You also have to be able to make connections with the material. So you may notice that occasionally I touch on these little comment boxes. Well, that's just me giving you text of my notes so that you can write down the words that are difficult to spell, like Bedouins or Mohammed or polytheism. But make sure that you're also listening to the lectures very closely, because that's where you're going to get a lot of those connections when it comes to our historical thinking skills of contextualization, causation, comparison, and continuity and change. So Islam is going to begin among the polytheistic Bedouin people. They were nomadic traders who basically controlled the caravan trade across the Arabian desert. And one of the key factors in the trade in the Arabian Peninsula is the use of camels. So camels are particularly useful because they can travel long distances without water. So they are beasts of burden that can help carry goods. And this use of camels is going to culturally diffuse not only throughout the Arabian Peninsula, but it's also going to culturally diffuse into Africa, where it's going to be very, very useful for the trans-Saharan trade. So keep that in mind when we get to our unit on Africa. Cultural diffusion, just like our historical thinking skills, is going to be one of those key terms that you really want to take note of, because oftentimes there are going to be short answer questions that ask about either cultural diffusion or cultural syncretism. So it's important to note that cultural diffusion happens through trade and conquest. And so you see that the camel culturally diffuses through the Arabian Peninsula through trade, and then eventually travels to Africa, where the camel is going to be instrumental for the Saharan trade routes. And so among the Bedouins, Muhammad was a manager of a Bedouin caravan. And through his cultural diffusion, through his trade, through his work, he's going to come into contact with a lot of different peoples, including monotheistic peoples. The Bedouins, Muhammad's culture, was polytheistic, meaning that they believed in multiple gods. Now, one of those gods was Allah, but they don't worship him as the one true God. They have multiple. But it's interesting to note that through his business, Muhammad is going to come into contact with many monotheistic religions. And that could play a role in the development of Islam as a monotheistic religion. Now, nomadic just means that they don't set down hard roots, so essentially they're going to be very used to moving about. They're tribal in that they have a clan or a tribe that's based on family membership, but also you're going to see that the head of each tribe is going to be a tribal council, with the head of the tribal council being the sheikh. And this culture is going to emphasize honesty, generosity, and tribal ties, but also going to emphasize the practice of polygamy. Poly means many, gyne means women, and so this is the marriage of one man to more than one wife. And so that is a cultural aspect that we're going to see continued in the Islamic religion as it emerges due to its roots in the Bedouin culture. The Arabian cities of Mecca and Yathrib are going to be hugely important when it comes to trade. These are economic hubs. Eventually, Muhammad is going to have to leave Mecca as people find his monotheistic religion to be controversial and they don't want his religion and his followers in Mecca, and so they're going to retreat to Yathrib, which is eventually going to be renamed Medina, meaning it's the city of the Prophet. And so from Mecca to Medina, Muhammad and his followers are going to stay in Medina until they can get enough forces to come back in 632 to Mecca to conquer it. Trade during this time in these cities is going to lead to a lot of cultural diffusion. You can see that the land routes are primarily going to be traveled via camel. There are major empires surrounding the Arabian Peninsula, including the Byzantine Empire in the north and the Sassanid Empire in the north and the east. And Sassanid is just referring to the dynasty or the empire at the time. It's mostly referring to the civilization of the Persians, like in Mesopotamia. But you're going to see a change over time develop here. Okay, that's one of our historical thinking skills, change over time. Sea trade is going to become more popular than trade by land. And you can probably understand why, because there's only so much stuff you can put on a camel before that camel gets tired and says, I'm not dragging your goods anywhere. But let's say you have a ship. Well, a ship, you can load that up with as much goods as you want. A ship doesn't get tired. And so more goods are going to be able to be traded in bulk, kind of like Costco style, by ship, rather than trying to move everything via camel. And so sea trade is going to increase in popularity. What does that lead to? A decrease in land trade. What does that lead to? A decreased economy. This is not only cause and effect, but also change over time. So it's important that you make notes of that and that you're able to make those connections with various SFI or specific factual information that we come into contact through our lectures. Now, Mecca was not only an economic hub, it was also a religious center for many polytheistic pilgrims. So these pilgrims would come and visit this large black sacred stone known as the Kaaba. All right, now, at this time, it is meant for a polytheistic religion, meaning many gods. When Muhammad comes around and starts preaching about only one God, that's going to upset a lot of people in Mecca because they are used to a culture that is polytheistic. Hence him being pushed out of Mecca to Medina and then having to come back with an army in order to rededicate the city and the Kaaba to the one true God, Allah. So trade is going to bring not only polytheistic believers to the city, but it's also going to bring monotheistic believers like the Jews and Christians to the city, which, as we said before, was influential in the development of Islam as another monotheistic faith with the same God. But how does it get started? It gets started in 622, when, according to the Quran, Islam was founded by the Prophet when the angel Gabriel came to him. Gabriel's one of the angels, and dictated God's words to Muhammad. Now, Muhammad was illiterate, and so he had to memorize the Quran to put it into his memory, and then come down from the mountain and later have it transcribed for future generations. So Islam is founded by the Prophet Muhammad, and you're going to see that its main tenets or beliefs include that it is against materialism, and it's also against polytheism. So new rules. Can't have multiple gods. You can only have one. New rules. You're supposed to be against the excessive gain of wealth, like what we see in the commercial practices or the business practices in Mecca, and instead you're supposed to help the poor. And so under Islam, polytheism is going to be bad, and the excessive commercial practices at the time in generating excessive wealth are going to be considered bad. What's good? Social justice, like the paying of alms to the poor or to the needy. Now you may notice that in these parts of the PowerPoint, I've blocked out the face of the prophet. That's because it is disrespectful to depict the prophet. And so in maintaining with those beliefs, I've gone ahead and edited accordingly. But typically you're going to see that after he receives the recitation from the angel Gabriel, that depictions are going to show him surrounded with a holy fire, which also in Christianity was considered a sign of being touched by the Holy Spirit. But you're also going to see that his face is going to be covered. So there are no depictions of Muhammad because it's considered disrespectful. So the Muslims believe that the archangel Gabriel visited Muhammad and taught him the Quran. And from this, we're going to see the core theological beliefs of Islam. Okay, those core theological beliefs include that the Quran was a recitation of the word of Allah. Now, they do not worship Muhammad as a god, right? He is a prophet, the last prophet in a long line of prophets, which included Jesus and Moses and Abraham. Okay, so remember those ties back to the Christian and Judaic origins, another monotheistic faiths at the time. But they do not worship Muhammad himself as a god. In that same line of thought, Jesus was not a deity. He was not the Son of God, but rather a prophet, much like Muhammad. So he is highly respected in the Islamic faith, just not worshipped as a deity. You're also going to see the establishment of the 5 pillars of the faith, which we're going to go into detail in the next lecture. There's also the concept of the word jihad. Now, jihad means a struggle, and this is supposed to refer to an inner struggle, like the struggle to do better, the struggle to follow the teachings of Allah. And then the Sharia code of law. The Sharia law was established after the death of Muhammad because Muhammad was not only a religious leader, he was also a political and military leader. And so he's not only going to have an impact on the development of the faith, you're also going to see that there are certain laws that come into being due to this mixing of church and state, essentially. And so within the Sharia code of law, it's going to emphasize morality and honesty. It's going to ban the eating of pork, the drinking of alcohol, the sin of gambling, and it's also going to have rules about marriage in terms of how many wives you can have. Now, y'all may remember that when we talked about the Bedouin tribe, one of the cultural attributes of the Bedouin tribe was polygamy. Now, Muhammad himself is going to have 4 wives, and so the cap or the maximum on polygamy is going to follow the practices of Muhammad, meaning that from then on, there's going to be a limit on how many wives you can have. You can't have an unlimited number of wives. It's going to be maxed out at 4. So Muhammad is going to start preaching in the city of Mecca, and he's going to gain some followers that are going to become known as Muslims. But as he starts gaining more and more followers, this is going to start attracting some negative attention from the leaders of Mecca. Because remember, Mecca is an economic hub. It is a center for trade. There's a lot of money being made in Mecca. Not only that, it also makes money from pilgrimages. Remember, when all these people come on their pilgrimage to Mecca, they have to spend a lot of money. And whenever you travel anywhere, you're going to have to think about, I got to buy food, I've got to buy gas, I've got to pay for a place to sleep at night. And so not only are they making money off of the trade coming through Mecca, they're also going to be making money off of the quote-unquote religious tourism. And so when Muhammad comes around saying, we need to stop worshiping many gods, we need to narrow it down to just the one God, the leaders of Mecca are going to be very much against that because that cuts into their profits. And so as a result, they're persecuting him and his followers, and that's going to lead to his flight from Mecca to Yathrib. And that flight is called the Hijra, and that begins the Islamic calendar. So Muhammad is going to leave Mecca and move to Yathrib, and there he's going to amass more followers, which is going to lead to the renaming of Yathrib to Medina, meaning the city of the Prophet. Once he has gained a larger following, he is going to form an army, and he's going to take that army back to Mecca and take the city over. And once the city surrenders, the polytheistic idols throughout the city are going to be destroyed, and the Prophet is going to rededicate the sacred black stone known as the Kaaba to the one true God. Now, Muhammad is going to die in 632, in the same year that he conquers Mecca, but that doesn't mean that Islam dies with him. Islam is going to continue, mostly through the leadership of the caliphs who follow after him, which we are going to discuss in much further detail later in the lecture. So the religion continues, and it spreads mostly through trade and military conquest. Okay, so this is cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is the spread of ideas or people or culture like religion, language, clothing, and typically that's going to occur through trade and through military conquest. So we're going to see that that is a continuity in Islam, with its roots from the Bedouin tribe, which is a very economically focused on trade. Right, so the Bedouin tribe has roots in nomadic trade. That's one aspect. And then with the rise of Muhammad, not only as a religious leader, but also as a military and political leader, Islam spreads through trade and military conquest. However, Islam and its spread is going to be very tolerant of other religions. There are no forced conversions to Islam. So even though Muhammad's army under his caliphs are going to continue to expand and take more territory in the Arabian Peninsula and onwards, that does not mean that they force people to convert via the sword. Forced conversions were against the belief systems developed under Islam. So they're going to be very tolerant of other religions. They're going to refer to Jews and Christians as the people of the book, since they all stem from the same ancestry. They all trace back to the prophet Abraham. There's going to be a mutual respect, or at least there's going to be respect on the part of the Islamic empires. Later, during the Crusades, that kind of falls apart. But there aren't going to be any forced conversions of Jews or Christians to Islam. Instead, they're going to have to pay a tax, and that tax is known as the jizya. So if you live in a territory that is conquered by Islamic forces, you can continue to go to your church, you continue to worship your god or gods, whatever you prefer, but you will have to pay a tax to the new ruler because you're under a new empire now. And so that's going to be considered very tolerant, and that's going to lead to social stability. Higher religious tolerance means that people are less likely to rebel or to revolt, and so that's going to lead to social stability and peace, which is good for the economy as well. So this is where we're going to end for the first part of our lecture with the origins, and our next lecture is going to move on to Islamic beliefs.